October 14th, 1965. Atlanta, Georgia. After having dinner with a friend, 25-year-old bank secretary Mary Shotwell Little vanishes without explanation. The following day, her abandoned vehicle is discovered with traces of blood and Mary's undergarments inside. The case would contain many bizarre developments, including alleged sightings of Mary using her gasoline card in North Carolina alongside unidentified male companions, and the subsequent unsolved murder of the woman who took over Mary's job at the bank. However, Mary Shotwell Little is never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering a very strange missing persons case, the 1965 disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little. It's a common practice to refer to the truly bizarre and convoluted unsolved mysteries as rabbit holes, but this case, it's not so much a rabbit hole as it is a rabbit bottomless pit. When selecting stories for this podcast, I often have a tendency to focus on mysteries which have a lot of inexplicable elements, but this one ranks right up there as one of the weirdest I've ever come across. We have a young newlywed woman who goes missing, and while there's a lot of compelling evidence to suggest foul play, there's other evidence which convince some of the original investigators that Mary might have staged her own disappearance. This is one of those mysteries where there are numerous possible explanations about what happened, but none of them make complete sense. This episode also contains a compelling mystery within a mystery involving a woman named Diane Shields, who took over Mary's job after she vanished, but was murdered herself less than 2 years later. So I'm going to examine whether these two cold cases might be connected. But before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and shorter mini-sodes. We deliver either a new episode or a new mini-sode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it and leave us a rating or review on any of those sites, because that will help us garner more exposure. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on our website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the convoluted, unsolved disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little. Our story begins in Atlanta, Georgia in 1965. Our central figure is 25-year-old Mary Shotwell Little, a newlywed who has been married to her husband Roy Little for 6 weeks. Mary works as a secretary in the personnel department of the Citizens and Southern Bank, while Roy is a bank examiner currently training to become an auditor with the state banking department. On October 14th, Roy has traveled to the town of LaGrange to complete his training, so after finishing her shift at work, Mary makes arrangements to meet a female co-worker named Isla Stack for dinner at the Piccadilly Cafeteria in the Lenox Square shopping center. After buying 4 bags of groceries at a nearby store and placing them inside her vehicle, a gray 1965 Mercury Comet, Mary arrives at the cafeteria for dinner. According to Isla, Mary appeared to be in good spirits and said that when Roy returned home the following evening, they were planning to hold a party for their friends at their apartment. At around 8 p.m., Mary said goodbye to Isla and walked in the direction of her Mercury Comet, which was parked in a nearby lot. But what actually happened to Mary after that has been analyzed and debated for the past 50 years. The following morning, Mary did not show up for work at the bank or call in, which was very uncharacteristic of her. When Mary's co-workers attempted to phone her, she could not be reached, and Mary's landlady informed them that she had not even retrieved her newspaper that morning. Isla Stack told Mary's boss, Jean Rackley, about their dinner the previous night, and that she last saw Mary heading in the direction of her Mercury Comet. So Rackley phoned the Lenox Square shopping center and asked security to check if Mary's vehicle was still parked in the lot, but they said they could not find it. Well, at around noon, Rackley decided to travel to Lenox Square himself, and after searching the lot for a couple minutes, he finally did come across Mary's gray Mercury Comet and notified the police. The vehicle's engine was cold, and there was a lot of disturbing evidence inside. A pair of women's underwear, a slip, and a girdle were neatly folded and placed on the console between the front seats. A bra was also neatly folded and lying on the floorboard alongside a stocking which had been cut by a knife. But most disturbingly, there were speckles of blood on the undergarments and small traces of blood throughout various sections of the vehicle, including the steering wheel, the front seats, the driver's side door, and the inside window of the passenger side. There were also grass clippings stuck to the blood on the front seats, and an unidentified fingerprint in the blood on the steering wheel. While the fingerprint did not match Mary, testing would show that the blood in the car was likely hers. However, there wasn't nearly enough blood to suggest she had suffered a fatal injury. If that wasn't enough, the 4 bags of groceries Mary had purchased prior to her dinner with Isla Stack were still in the vehicle, along with some Coke bottles and a pair of Kent cigarettes, which was known to be Mary's brand. There was also a coating of red dust on the Comet's exterior to suggest it had been recently driven on a dirt road. However, Mary's car keys, along with her purse and the rest of her clothing, were nowhere to be found. Well, Mary was officially reported missing, and the case would take a number of strange turns. Investigators would eventually discover that Mary's gasoline card was used in North Carolina on 2 separate occasions on the very same day her vehicle was discovered. The first usage of the card took place at an all-night Esso station in the very early morning hours of October 15th, sometime between midnight and 2:30 a.m. This occurred in Charlotte, which also happened to be Mary's original hometown and where her parents still lived. The second usage of the card took place at another Esso station in Raleigh around 12 hours later. What was especially unnerving and lent credibility to these sightings is that the attendants at both of these stations told strikingly similar stories. In Charlotte, the woman matching Mary's description was accompanied by an unshaven, middle-aged man. She was lying in the front seat with a newspaper over her head, which appeared to be treating a head injury. The only time she stirred is when the man used her gasoline card and gave her the credit slip for her to sign. Now, the attendant in Raleigh claimed that this woman was accompanied by 2 unshaven middle-aged men. Once again, she seemed to be treating a cut on her head, and this time, there were also traces of blood on her leg. And once again, her gasoline card was used by the men, and the credit slip was given to her to sign. Both attendants reported that the woman appeared to be hiding her face, made no attempt to signal for help, and that her male companion, or companions, seemed to be very controlling of her. But most interestingly, she signed both the credit slips with the name Mrs. Roy H. Little, Jr. While no one could say with absolute certainty that the signature was in Mary's handwriting, the consensus seemed to be that it looked like hers. Frustratingly, neither attendant was able to provide a detailed description of the car these men drove. Now, here's an important detail about this case where there's some contradictory information. If you look at the summary of this case on the Charlie Project, it says that when Mary's vehicle was found in the Lenox Square parking lot, it had a North Carolina license plate attached to it, which was later discovered to have been stolen from a vehicle in Charlotte. However, some of the newspaper articles I've come across state that the gas station attendants in North Carolina took down the license number of the car they saw, and that this turned out to be the stolen license plate. So I'm not entirely sure which account is accurate here, but the basic gist of everything is that someone stole a license plate off a vehicle in Charlotte and attempted to use it to cover their tracks. So the most bizarre thing about these sightings at the separate gas stations is that they took place 12 hours apart, but Charlotte and Raleigh are only about a 2.5-hour drive from one another, and while I can't be certain how much gas was purchased in Raleigh, a 2.5-hour drive from Charlotte would not burn through your entire tank. So the implication seems to be that Mary and her male companions may have driven to another unknown location during that 12-hour window. But there's also a question of where and how far the Mercury comet traveled before it was discovered in the parking lot. Mary and Roy both drove the vehicle, and Roy kept detailed mileage logs for it. After checking these logs against the reading on the vehicle's odometer, investigators estimated that there were 41 miles which could not be accounted for. So if the comet did leave the Lenox Square parking lot after Mary finished having dinner, it wouldn't have been driven a great distance, and certainly not as far as Charlotte, North Carolina, which is nearly 250 miles away from Atlanta. Now, mall security claimed that the comet wasn't in the parking lot when Gene Rackley asked them to look for it the following morning. You could easily assume that they simply missed it, but the problem was that no one remembered seeing it in the parking lot overnight or the early morning. In fact, a patrol cop drove through the lot at 6 a.m., and he claimed he did not see the comet parked there. Nothing about the timeline of events seemed to add up at all, so what exactly was going on here? It's worth noting that a few days after Mary's disappearance, another woman came forward to police and reported that she had been accosted by a thin man with a brown crew cut in the Lenox Square parking lot on the evening of October 14th. The woman thought she was being followed, so she climbed into her car and locked the door, when this man suddenly appeared to knock on the window and tell her that the back tire was low. She ignored him and instantly drove off, and when she stopped at a gas station to check her tires, she discovered they were completely fine. This incident apparently took place only minutes before Mary was last seen walking towards her car. It's quite a compelling coincidence, but no one ever identified this man, and there was at least one witness who recalled seeing Mary drive the comet out of the lot that night, lending credence to the idea that she was abducted elsewhere. So investigators explored other possible scenarios, starting with Mary's husband, Roy Little. On the surface, Roy might have seemed like a solid suspect, since he was not exactly the most likable guy in the world, and apparently did not show an overwhelming amount of concern about his wife's disappearance. He refused to take a lie detector test on 2 separate occasions, and when he was shown the comet, he didn't seem too fazed by all the blood inside, and was much more concerned about when the police would return it because he needed the vehicle for driving. Apparently, some of Mary's friends disliked Roy so much that they refused to attend their wedding. All that being said, Mary had always given off the impression she was happy with her marriage, and while Roy stood to collect a modest insurance settlement if Mary died, he didn't really have much of a motive. But most importantly, Roy was out of town in LaGrange, which was over an hour away from Atlanta, so he had a rock-solid alibi. So Roy was ruled out as a suspect, but shortly thereafter, he received an anonymous phone call from an unknown male demanding a $20,000 ransom for Mary's return. The caller told Roy to go to an overpass in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, where he said further instructions would be posted on a sign. Well, since Mary had apparently been kidnapped across state lines, this was now a federal offense, so the FBI got involved, and one of their agents went to the overpass in Roy's place. He did find the sign in question, but it turned out that a blank piece of paper was attached there. Anyway, the caller never contacted Roy again, but authorities leaned towards the whole thing being a hoax, as the call did take place shortly after Roy and Mary's mother had both made a televised plea for her safe return. Anyway, now that the FBI was involved in the case, they started investigating Mary's background and learned a lot of potentially unsettling things. According to some of Mary's friends, in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, she had been receiving a series of phone calls at her workplace and seemed visibly shaken by them. On one occasion, Mary was overheard telling the caller, "I'm a married woman now," but curiously, she followed this up with the sentence, "You can come over to my house anytime you like, but I can't come over there." In addition, Mary also received a dozen roses at her apartment from an anonymous secret admirer, and she never told her husband about it. The roses were purchased from a florist close to where Mary lived, but investigators were unable to find out who sent them. However, while Mary's friends knew about the phone calls and the flowers, she never openly discussed these things with them, so they had no information to offer. All that being said, Mary did tell her friends that she was fearful of driving alone or being home alone when Roy was out of town, and she seemed to imply she had something important she really wanted to tell them. But she never elaborated on any of this. If that wasn't enough, investigators also learned from Mary's boss, Gene Rackley, that the bank had hired a former FBI agent to investigate possible issues with lesbian sexual harassment and possible prostitution taking place on the bank's property. Even though this apparently caused a lot of tension at the bank, Rackley insisted this was nothing more than a minor scandal involving low-level workers and that Mary never knew about it. However, that contradicted statements from Mary's mother and one of her friends that Mary had told them about this investigation. And there was also a bizarre incident involving a former roommate of Mary's. Shortly after she was questioned by police, the woman's husband received an anonymous phone call from a man who stated, "Your wife is next," before he hung up. The next major development occurred in 1966, when the FBI interviewed an inmate at Georgia State Prison who was serving a life sentence for murder. He claimed that two men told him they'd been paid $5,000 each to kidnap a woman named Mary, and then showed him Mary Shotwell Little's credit card as proof. They took him to a house in Mount Holly, North Carolina, where Mary was being held captive, and she was subsequently murdered, though the inmate claimed he had no direct participation in the crime. He also claimed to have no idea who hired these two men, only that Mary had apparently found out something they did not want her talking about. Well, no evidence was ever found to corroborate this guy's story, and it was pretty much rejected by investigators at the time, but we'll get back to it later. However, there's one more creepy postscript to this story. Shortly after Mary's disappearance, Diane Shields, a 22-year-old employee at the Citizens and Southern Bank, was transferred to Mary's department to take over her position, and she even got to work at Mary's desk. Diane also befriended many of Mary's colleagues, and even lived with one of Mary's former roommates for a time. Well, by 1967, Diane had left her job at the bank, and was now working at a place called Georgia Associated Industries. At 5 p.m. on May 19th, she was last seen leaving her work in her Chevrolet Impala, but at 2:30 a.m. the following morning, the vehicle was found abandoned in one of Atlanta's business districts, with Diane's body in the trunk. She had been suffocated when a scarf and a piece of paper from a phone book were shoved down her throat, and she'd also received a sharp blow to the back of her head. Diane was not sexually assaulted, and nothing was stolen from her, not even her diamond engagement ring, so no one could figure out the motive for this crime. In an eerie parallel, Diane had also been receiving roses prior to her disappearance, but in this case, they were able to track down the person who sent the flowers and rule them out as a suspect. However, according to Diane's best friend, Diane had told her she was secretly working undercover with the police, trying to help them solve the disappearance of a woman named Mary, but no official record was ever found to suggest that Diane was involved in the investigation. But here's a really strange detail. One of the detectives was quoted in the papers saying that he believed Diane's case and Mary's case might be connected, and he soon received a phone call from Mary's mother, who said she did not want the investigation into her daughter's case to be pursued any further. No one knows why she did this, but other than the fact that Mary and Diane had worked the same job, no tangible connection was ever found between their disappearances. Anyway, there wouldn't be any more major developments in Mary's case, but there was apparently a divided reaction within the police department about what they believe happened. Some of the investigators felt that Mary was abducted and eventually met with foul play, but others thought she might have staged her own disappearance, and the phone call from Mary's mother asking them to stop the investigation may have added more fuel to these rumors. And it's also worth noting that for reasons unknown, the police file for Mary's case also mysteriously went missing in the years after she vanished. But whatever the real truth, there has been no trace of Mary Shotwell Little in over 50 years. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So, yeah, remember my line from the intro about this being a rabbit bottomless pit? I can't think of too many missing persons cases which suit that phrase more than this one. There are just so many confusing developments here, and you could dream up a number of potential theories about what might have happened. This is considered to be the most famous missing persons case in the history of Atlanta, but I'm surprised it's not more well known outside the area. Like other famous missing persons cases, it sounds like this one has sparked some divisive reactions. Some of the investigators seem completely stumped by it, but others thought that Mary herself was responsible. However, here's a perfect example of how none of the theories make complete sense. In an article from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a retired FBI agent who worked on the case expressed his belief that Mary was abducted in the Lenox Square parking lot by the same unidentified man with the brown crew cut who accosted the other woman. According to him, this man carjacked Mary, took her to another location to sexually assault her, returned to the parking lot to switch vehicles, and then drove Mary to North Carolina in his own vehicle, where he subsequently murdered her and buried her body at an unknown location. Well, that's a perfectly logical theory, but it doesn't account for a lot of unanswered questions, such as why this man would keep Mary alive for another day, drive her to a different state, and take her to two separate gas stations which were hundreds of miles apart. That seems like a lot of extra effort for a predator whose primary motive was sexual assault. So in order to examine this case, I'm going to start from the very beginning and look at all possible angles to see if I can come up with a concrete theory which makes, or at least almost makes, complete logical sense. Well, for any disappearance involving a newlywed, the first thing you have to do is look at the spouse, but in this particular case, that seems like the least likely explanation. Due to his cold, seemingly uncaring behavior, Roy Little might fit the profile of your typical uncaring husband who wanted to get rid of his wife, but the guy had an alibi placing him over 60 miles outside of Atlanta when she went missing. Yes, I suppose it's not impossible that Roy could have hired someone to abduct and murder Mary, but there's just no motive for him to do this. The couple had only been married 6 weeks, they had no financial problems, Roy's financial gain from her death was very minimal, and even though Mary's friends didn't like Roy, she always gave off the impression that she was happy with her marriage. You can find lots of examples of murders and missing persons cases where the spouse came off looking cold, but then turned out to be completely innocent. Some people are just not good at showing their emotions, and it sounds like Roy Little was one of them. There just seem to be many more plausible scenarios other than him being responsible. But even though Mary gave off the impression that her marriage was fine, it sounds like she had some other issues going on in her life. There was someone who felt the need to frequently call Mary at work, and an anonymous suitor who sent roses to her apartment, and for all we know, this could have been the same person. It sounds like Roy had no idea that any of this was happening. This doesn't mean Mary was having an affair, but at the very least, it sounds like she was resisting someone's advances. One coworker overheard a phone conversation in which Mary exclaimed she was a married woman, but then said, "You can come over to my house anytime you like, but I can't come over there." I don't know if the coworker misheard certain sections of that conversation or took things out of context, but that's a pretty weird thing to say. If Mary was conducting an affair or trying to get rid of someone who had developed an obsession with her, she's not going to give him an open invitation to come over to her place. Mary's friends did claim that she seemed fearful of something, but it's worth noting that Mary's coworker, Isla Stack, said she appeared to be in good spirits and didn't express any issues at all during their dinner together right before she went missing. So now that we've examined the events leading up to Mary's disappearance, let's examine the circumstances of the disappearance itself. All of these things I've talked about might be a non-issue if Mary was the victim of a random abduction, which is certainly a possibility. Remember, we have a female witness who claims she was accosted by a strange man in the Lenox Square parking lot only minutes before Mary walked towards her car, so if this man was responsible, then Mary would have been selected at random. Like I said earlier, one of the FBI agents on the case seemed to think this man drove Mary to another location in her Mercury Comet, sexually assaulted her, and then drove Mary back to the Lenox Square parking lot. If Mary was raped inside her own vehicle, then this would account for why her undergarments were found there. It would also account for those extra 41 miles on the odometer. That seems like a perfectly plausible distance for the perpetrator to drive Mary out of the city into a remote area and then drive back to the parking lot. But what this theory doesn't account for is the sightings of Mary at the separate gas stations in North Carolina, which throw a real monkey wrench into this whole thing. I've stated multiple times on this podcast that eyewitness identification can often be wrong, and that it's very common for well-meaning people to mistake someone they see for a missing person. In this case, the woman the two gas station attendants saw seemed to make a concerted effort to hide her face from them, so it would be easy to mistake her for Mary. But this woman used Mary's gasoline card and signed her name Mrs. Roy H. Little, Jr. I guess it's not impossible that another woman could have stolen Mary's card and forged her signature, but considering that both witnesses reported that this woman had a noticeable head injury and seemed frightened of her male companion, I have to think she was Mary. And that's why it's hard to believe that Mary was the randomly selected victim of a sexual predator, because I just don't know why he would take her to another state and keep her alive so long. Of course, it's possible that whoever abducted Mary wanted to keep her in captivity for a while as his sex slave or something. It might seem brazen to take your captive to a gas station and make her use her own card to pay for fuel, but if the abductor lived a great distance away from Atlanta, then perhaps pulling over for gas was unavoidable. Maybe the reason he made such a long journey from North Carolina to abduct a woman in Atlanta was because he knew that abducting someone from the area in which he lived would attract too much attention. You might be wondering why Mary made no attempt to signal for help at the gas station, but given that she already had a serious head injury and had likely been assaulted by this point, her captor probably frightened her into staying silent. However, the most baffling part of this whole story is that this exact same situation happened at another gas station in Raleigh 12 hours later. If these sightings had occurred within a 3-hour window of each other, then that would be one thing, as Raleigh could have just been another stop on their trip to wherever they were going. But it does not take 12 hours to drive from Charlotte to Raleigh, and you should not have to refill your tank again after driving that distance, so the implication seemed to be that Mary and her captive traveled somewhere else before they went to Raleigh, but we have no idea where. And of course, there had to have been more than one person involved in this, especially since the gas station in Raleigh claimed he saw 2 men with Mary. I can only assume this second man might have been dealing with Mary's Mercury Comet at the time she was seen at the gas station in Charlotte, but I really don't know what to make of the situation with the Comet. I could believe the theory that Mary's abductor drove her somewhere to assault her and then returned to the Lenox Square parking lot to switch vehicles, but the problem is that nobody remembers seeing the Comet parked there until Gene Rackley discovered it at around noon the following day. Now, when Rackley called mall security earlier that morning and they told him they couldn't find the vehicle, I would ordinarily be inclined to think they simply just missed it. Yet we have a police officer who was pretty certain the Comet was not there when he patrolled the lot at 6 a.m., and other witnesses seem to concur that it wasn't there overnight. When a shopping center is closed, you have to think their parking lot is pretty much going to be empty. Missing the Comet in a crowded lot on a busy day is one thing, but an empty lot in the middle of the night? I'm not so sure it could be missed. It sounds like Mary and her male companion were spotted at the gas station in Charlotte sometime between midnight and 2:30 a.m., so if the Comet wasn't parked in the lot during that time, somebody else had to have it in their possession. The way Mary's undergarments were folded and blood was smeared throughout the interior of the Comet gave off the impression that the scene had been staged, though it would have been pretty brazen for someone to try that in a shopping center parking lot in broad daylight. And let's not forget that depending on whether you believe the Charlie Project profile or the news articles, either the Comet or the vehicle spotted at the gas station had a stolen license plate attached to it. I'm going to assume the info from the news articles is correct, because it makes a lot more sense to attach a stolen license plate to your vehicle when you're driving it into a public place with a captive woman, rather than attaching the plate to a vehicle you've just abandoned somewhere. But I'll reiterate, all this planning seems far too complicated to be the work of a sexual predator who selected Mary at random to be his victim. So what could have been the real reason to kidnap her? Well, we did have someone phone in an anonymous ransom demand to Mary's husband, Roy. Granted, whenever there's a high-profile missing persons case like this, it's fairly common for people who had nothing to do with the disappearance to send fake ransom demands so that easily could have happened here. However, this one is a bit more unusual than most, since whoever was responsible went to the trouble of sending Roy to a specific location and leaving a blank piece of paper there. This may have been nothing more than a stupid prank, but since Roy sent an FBI agent in his place, this also could have been a ploy for the kidnapper to check if Roy had contacted the authorities, and when they found out he did, they decided to back off on their ransom demands. The ransom call was probably just a hoax, but I can't completely discount it because of that inmate's story about two men being paid $5,000 each to kidnap Mary before they murdered her in Mount Holly, North Carolina. The authorities did not put a lot of stock into this man's story at the time, but it has gained some traction in recent years, thanks largely to the website maryshotwelllittle.blogspot.com. The blog is run by an attorney named Susan Carpenter Scott, who decided to conduct a personal investigation into this case. She actually obtained records of the interview the FBI conducted with the inmate in 1966, and has posted a transcript of it on her blog with the names redacted. In 2014, the Charlotte Observer published an article about how a retired Atlanta police detective decided to look into this angle. He claimed that he saw a photo of a house in Mount Holly which matched the description of the house where Mary was supposedly murdered, but it has since been demolished. The reason Susan Carpenter Scott doesn't completely discount the inmate's story is because of the amount of specific detail he provided about what happened. If you want to read the full transcript of his interview, you can go to maryshotwelllittle.blogspot.com and judge for yourself whether his story sounds credible. Personally, my main issue, and this issue was shared by the investigating agents, is that there's no real reason for this inmate to have been there to witness these events in the first place. If you believe his story, two men who barely knew him allowed him to tag along on a kidnapping scheme where he didn't actually do anything, and they didn't seem to mind that he was just hanging around in the background while they murdered a woman. What possible reason could they have for involving this guy in the first place? If there's any truth at all to his story, I would not be surprised if he changed key details to make himself sound like more of an innocent bystander and left out parts where he actually did something bad. And of course, he also claimed to have no idea who hired these men to kidnap Mary, or what their motive could have been. In case you're wondering, Mount Holly is only located about 15 miles away from Charlotte, but I really don't know how the extra sighting of Mary in Raleigh would have fit into the equation, since that's a drive of nearly 3 hours in the opposite direction. But for now, let's move on to the next theory that Mary's disappearance is connected with something going on at her workplace, the Citizens and Southern Bank. Remember, there was apparently an internal investigation going on there about alleged lesbian harassment and prostitution, and while Mary's boss, Jean Rackley, claims she knew nothing about it, her mother and one of her friends disagree. I don't know if I should read anything into the fact that it was Rackley who discovered Mary's comet in the Lenox Square parking lot a few hours after security told him it wasn't there. I guess it's nothing more than a coincidence, and someone else could have parked it there after security checked the lot, but still, it's pretty odd. I guess I wouldn't put much stock into this alleged scandal at the bank, if not for the fact that Diane Shields, the very woman who took over Mary's job, wound up being murdered less than 2 years later. That is a pretty staggering coincidence, especially when you consider that Diane was also roommates with one of Mary's former roommates. All that being said, a key detail which often gets overlooked is that Diane was not actually working at the bank when she was murdered. I don't know if there were any suspicious reasons why Diane left her job at the bank, but she was employed elsewhere by that time. We have one friend who claimed that Diane was working undercover with the police to help solve the disappearance of a woman named Mary, and it sounds like a story out of a movie. A woman is sent undercover to work at the place of employment of a missing woman to gather information, but before she blows the lid off the whole thing, she winds up being murdered herself. Yeah, that sounds pretty far-fetched to me. I think there are just too many differences between Mary and Diane's cases for me to think they're connected. For one thing, Diane's body was found in the trunk of her car on a public street in the business district of Atlanta. If Mary was murdered, then whoever was responsible went to the trouble of hiding her body and ensuring it would never be found. Yet Diane's body was practically left right out there in the open. If someone from the bank had Diane murdered to cover up for the fact that they were involved in Mary's murder 19 months earlier, you'd think they'd be a lot more discreet about it. And if Diane was working undercover with the police, why would she just transfer to another job without giving them the necessary information to close their case? I admit, I cannot figure out what the motive for Diane's murder might be. She was not sexually assaulted, and nothing was stolen from her, so even without the connection to Mary Shotwell Little, it's still a pretty baffling unsolved crime in its own right. However, I'm inclined to think its tie into this case is purely coincidental. So now we have to move on to the theory that there was no kidnapping or foul play, and that Mary staged the entire thing herself. Apparently there were quite a few police officers who worked on this case who thought this was a legitimate possibility. I've covered cases on the podcast where law enforcement initially assumed that a missing person just ran away or disappeared voluntarily, but the majority of the time, I usually think that option is so absurd that I don't even bother to entertain it. But there are a lot of things which are really off about this case, which is why I can't completely discount the possibility that Mary decided to dream up her own elaborate Gone Girl-esque disappearance. When Mary's comet was found in the Lenox Square parking lot, the consensus seemed to be that the scene had been staged, and I tend to agree, considering that Mary's undergarments were found inside without the rest of her clothing, and they were neatly folded. But the question is, did someone else stage the scene? Or did Mary do it herself? Well, the main thing which caused suspicion is the blood which was smeared throughout the interior of the vehicle. That may seem like an obvious sign of foul play, but it was actually a relatively small amount of blood which could have come from something as minor as a nosebleed. If an abductor had, say, busted Mary's nose during a struggle, it's pretty odd that they would go to the trouble of smearing her blood, but if Mary was planning to disappear, one can see how she might self-inflict a minor injury on herself to give off the impression that someone abducted and murdered her. All that being said, the witnesses who allegedly saw Mary at the gas station reported her having a head injury, so the blood could have easily come from there. Yet if Mary was kidnapped, it's odd that her abductor would just let her sit out in the open with noticeable blood on her head and her leg, and then have her personally sign the credit slips for her gasoline card. I mean, unless the abductor had no money whatsoever to pay for his own gas, it's incredibly brazen to use your captive's gasoline card and allow her to sign her own name during the transaction, leaving a full-fledged paper trail for your movements. This is one reason why police wondered if these separate transactions in Charlotte and Raleigh were a deliberate attempt at misdirection to lead the investigation away from Atlanta. This would prompt investigators to focus all their energies on North Carolina when the plan was actually for Mary to travel elsewhere. But if true, would this strategy have been the kidnapper's idea? Or was it Mary's? If she wanted to disappear voluntarily with one or two male companions, could she have deliberately staged these scenes at two different gas stations in order to give off the false impression she was a kidnap victim and lead authorities in the wrong direction? Remember, one of these sightings did take place in Charlotte, Mary's original hometown. The staged disappearance theory could be one possible explanation for Roy Little's rather cold, nonchalant behavior when he learned Mary went missing. If things were not going well in the marriage, and he suspected his wife just ran off, that might account for Roy's lack of concern and his seeming disinterest in finding Mary. And of course, one other weird thing which raised eyebrows is when Diane Shields' murder took place, and Mary's mother actually called the lead detective to ask him to stop the investigation into her daughter's disappearance. Now, it's true that people grieve in different ways, and that the bereaved family members of crime victims sometimes just want to move on with their lives, even if said crime hasn't been solved. However, this occurred only a year and a half after Mary's disappearance, which is why it's been speculated that her mother secretly knew Mary was still alive and hiding out somewhere, and just wanted the investigation to end. I don't know. I must say, this is one missing persons case where I can't completely discount the idea of a voluntary disappearance. Something like this would be very difficult to pull off today, but in 1965, it was much easier for someone to just disappear and start a new life if they wanted to. In recent years, we have seen a few cases where someone who went missing 4 or 5 decades ago was suddenly discovered to be alive and living under a new identity somewhere. So I guess it's possible Mary could have done that, but the question is, why? Well, Mary had recently just entered into a marriage with a guy who did not seem like the most warm, outgoing husband in the world, and her friends did not like him. Even though Mary acted like she was happy with her relationship, she could have been lying, and this was an era where getting a divorce after only 6 weeks of marriage would be heavily frowned upon. During her final dinner with Isla Stack, Mary kept going on about how great her marriage was, but this could have just been an act to plant the seeds, so that when she eventually went missing, no one would suspect she ran away, and everyone would suspect an abduction. But I think one of the biggest issues with the staged abduction theory is the fact that Mary was seen with 2 male companions. If there was only one man, then I could believe that maybe Mary ran off with a secret lover. However, Mary had 2 men with her when she was seen at a gas station in Raleigh. If you look at the timeline, it seems likely that someone else was planting Mary's vehicle in the parking lot in Atlanta while she was in North Carolina. So this means Mary would have to enlist at least 2 other men to help her stage her disappearance, and trust that both these guys would agree to stay quiet even after her disappearance garnered tons of publicity and became one of the most sensational missing persons cases in the history of the state. I'm just not sure I buy this. I really have my doubts that Mary disappeared voluntarily, and I think she was most likely abducted. No matter how you break it down, none of the theories about this case make complete sense. But believe it or not, even though the prison inmate story about 2 men being paid to kidnap and murder Mary was discounted by authorities at the time, I actually think it might be the most believable and logical explanation for what happened. I know this guy was a convicted murderer with an extensive criminal history, and definitely not the most credible witness in the world, but there are things about his story which seem to make sense. A lot of the weirdest stuff in this case, such as planting Mary's Comet at the shopping center, staging a violent scene in her vehicle, stealing a license plate from someone else's car, and taking Mary to different gas stations in order to mislead the authorities, that sounds like the workings of a very elaborate kidnap scheme, much like the inmate described. It does not sound like the work of a sexual predator who wanted to kidnap, assault, and murder a random woman for their own gratification. Someone seemed to have a very complicated motive for having Mary abducted. Now, I'm not saying I completely believe this inmate's story. If there's any truth to it, I think he was more directly involved than he let on, and changed a lot of details in order to avoid self-incrimination. But even if Mary was murdered by a group of men who kidnapped her, I still have no idea who would have hired them, or what their motive was. There's no real reason for her husband to do something like this. There are hints that Mary had a secret admirer or an obsessive stalker, but those type of people generally don't hire someone else to abduct their victim. I guess it's possible Mary could have found out about shady activity at her place of employment and that they orchestrated her abduction, but I've yet to hear any concrete evidence that there was something going on at the bank. But considering that Mary was seen in the company of 2 unidentified men, I'm inclined to believe those men did kidnap her. I think it's possible someone hired them to do it, but I have no idea who. In the end, I'm going to lead towards the kidnapping and murder theory, but if I'm way off base, and one of the other theories in this case is the correct explanation for what happened to Mary, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. I know that over 50 years have passed, but this is one mystery where I'd really love to learn the full circumstances of what actually happened. So if you have any information about the disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little, or if you know anything about the unsolved murder of Diane Shields, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. We also have a pair of new donors this week named Alicia and Ainsley, so a big thanks to both of you. And I'd like to conclude things by playing a promo for a podcast about another missing persons case from Georgia. You probably remember hearing us cover it on The Trail Went Cold last year. the 1990 disappearance of twin sisters Jeanette and Danette Millbrook. Well, I'm happy to announce that there is now a new multi-part investigative podcast devoted exclusively to that case called The Fall Line. Have a listen.
The Fall Line Podcast, a true crime audio serial, investigates the March 18, 1990 disappearance of Augusta, Georgia twins Danette and Jeanette Millbrook. The twins, who were 15 at the time, were treated without cause as runaways, and their case was closed less than a week after their 17th birthdays. Their family worked tirelessly to get the case reopened and finally managed to attract the notice of a newly elected sheriff in 2013. Since then, there has been no movement in the case, no leads, no investigative breakthroughs, and no answers. Why was the twins' case closed? What happened to their original case file? Why were they removed from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database? The Fall Line Podcast works to amplify the voices of the twins' family and to uncover facts, explore and dispel rumors, and develop theories in the case. Tune in, join the discussion on Facebook, and remember, we must find Danette and Jeanette Millbrook. Find us on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Just wanted to give another shout out to my fans from the Unsolved Mysteries message board, the Sitcoms Online forum, and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who provides the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.